So I'm Jim Brady, Vice President of Journalism for the Knight Foundation. And I'm joined here, and because I subbed in at the last minute, I'm going to have to read some things off my phone. So my apologies for the awkwardness of that. But I'm going to do my introductions now of the folks up here. Right next to me is Sam Cholke, who's the project director of Solving for Chicago. It's a collaborative of 23 print, digital, and broadcast newsrooms in Chicago working collaboratively to cover pressing issues and serving communities. Next to Sam is Alden Loury. He's the senior editor of the Race, Class, and Communities desk at WBEZ. Maybe the most, one of the most collaborative newsrooms in Chicago. They've been participating in these sorts of collaborations in the city for about the last 20 years. And all the way on the end is Lyon, Illinois Director of Partners in Health, who has helped lead the Chicagoland Vaccine Partnership, a collaborative of more than 160 community health organizations that have advocated for equitable access to vaccines and healthcare during the pandemic. And I'm trying to slow down because I'm a notoriously fast talker and I'm trying very hard to, so please feel free to just shoot me a sign if I'm going too fast. So anyway, I want to start by welcoming everybody to Chicago. This is a fitting place to have the conference this year because there's been collaborations going on in the city for longer than most other cities in the country. We're here to talk about one very specifically, but you can go back about 20 years, and I wanted to read something that Deborah Douglas wrote in The Guardian last year about Chicago's unique ability to continually innovate. Deborah wrote that as newspapers continue a nearly 2-decade decline, studies show that many communities are losing reliable information about local and state government and potentially fueling intense partisan politics, corruption, and inefficiency. And we know none of those things ever happen in Chicago. Chicago, however, is in a different situation. She did not write that, by the way. That was an echo. Chicago, however, is in a different situation. The city has a thriving experimental news scene. Chicago's web of news and information fills many of the coverage holes often left by legacy media, such as the Tribune, in a racially diverse city that is roughly 1/3 Latino, 1/3 white, and 1/3 Black. And those of us who spend time here, I have not lived in Chicago, but I should say as a full disclosure, I worked with Sam on Solving for Chicago when I was doing consulting working for the local media association. So I actually know a fair amount about this collaborative. But everybody knows the spirit of experimentation here is not new. As far back as 1990, Chicago newsrooms are working together on coverage through projects like Chicago Matters, which ran for almost 20 years before shuttering in 2009. And looking back now, a lot of it might sound familiar to those outside of Chicago, but collaboration at the time was the answer to the economic pressures wreaking havoc on traditional news outlets. And even back then, funding going beyond collaboration with just newsrooms. I'm sorry. I'm just reading, I don't understand the sentence. So this is what happens when you go at the last minute. So anyway, but the city's been at this for a long time. And after 30 years of collaboration, Chicago really is trying to help figure out what's next for journalism. So let's start with the questions since I'm fumbling my way through this. Alden, I want to start with you. You were an editor and then publisher at Chicago Reporter during Chicago Matters, and you're now the senior editor for Race, Class, and Community at Chicago Public Media, which has been a collaborator in the city for a long time. So you've seen collaboration probably more than most in the city and been involved in more of them. What is the benefits you've seen? Have the benefits of collaboration changed as business has gotten more challenged? And what do you just overall see as the benefits of collaboration?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. And thanks for doing this. Yes, I was at the Chicago Reporter for the last 10 years of Chicago Matters from 2000 through 2009. And it was a fabulous project. I mean, it was, essentially every year we go in, we think about what we were doing that particular year at the Reporter. And whatever Chicago Matters was going to be 3. We were 11 issues when I started there. We were 6 issues when I finished there. But it was literally 3 of our cover stories each year. So it was our signature effort. And we were partnering with public radio, public TV, and the public library. And so there were a lot of different things. We were an eclectic group. None of us did the same things necessarily. We covered news, but we covered it on different mediums. The library was its own animal. So in that collaboration, we really leaned on the strengths of each individual partner. But we did come together at the outset and figure out what it was that we were going to report on, what we were going to cover, what we were going to focus on, and what were some of the things that we really wanted to make sure we hit on that. And then from time to time, we were actually working on projects together. One year, Catalyst Chicago, which was our sister publication under the Community Renewal Society nonprofit. We partnered with them and with WBEZ on a number of stories around education when education was our theme that one year. But I think at that point, what collaboration was giving us a moment where we really zeroed in on one particular thing that was affecting Chicago and Chicagoland area. And then we were touching on it in a number of different ways. And so I thought it was a very informative, very dynamic and very powerful collaboration. And it felt very, since it had so much history, we'd go to those meetings every year, and I knew Mary Field and I knew Sally Isley, who was at the BEZ at the time as the news director. So even though we were only coming together for those meetings every year, there was some synergy and community among that. There was buy-in. We haggled sometimes on what we wanted to focus on, but there was buy-in on that. And the Trust was a great partner in terms of funding it, but then also in creating a space where we could work through that. And it was at the time something that we really hadn't seen being done. But I think it really kind of helped set the stage for what this thing could be. Collaboration I've seen has morphed some since then. Now you've got a much wider news ecosystem in Chicago. The Reporter was very unique at that time because it was one of the only institutions that was really looking at issues of race and inequality as a matter of course. But now you've got a number of outlets that are doing that, from City Bureau to Injustice Watch to a number of others, Tribe, you name it. And so, the economic struggles that the news organization or the news media is suffering. I think we were just really getting into that during those years with Chicago Matters. But certainly after 2008, the landscape has changed financially, and collaboration has become a necessity for a lot of places. But I think along the way, with more partners, with people who are more focused on some of the myriad ways Chicago is diverse and equitable and all of that, there have been a lot of very interesting partnerships that have cropped up. And sometimes those partnerships crop up in a very organic way. And then sometimes people are actually actively looking. So, hey, look, this is something we really want to tackle. I've got 6 reporters at my disposal. 4 of them are tied up on something. We want to get this thing out. Who can we work with that can help us, get this done? Who has a handle on a particular issue that maybe we don't really have. We don't have a strong suit. And some collaborations have happened that way. The BGA reached out to us maybe a couple of years ago for a story they wanted to do about public incentives that were being given to Amazon and some of these other places that were building these big warehouses. The South Suburbs was a place where a lot of that activity was happening. And David Kidwell, BGA, reached out to us and said, hey, look, we want to get this done. We've got a handle on some aspect of this, but there's an aspect of it that we're really kind of green on. We think you guys would be a great partner for us to help fill in that gap. And so, I work with Natalie Moore, and we work with David and the freelancer, John Lippert, that was working with them. And they had already done a ton of work, but what we brought was an understanding of what the struggles were in the South Suburbs and how this particular issue was having a unique effect on those communities. And so through the reporting and the editing process, there was a lot that we added that gave it a much fuller, more complete a view of that story. And that's also an aspect of what collaboration can bring. Some of the other things I think have been great have been, as you've had some of these smaller, the landscape of these smaller kind of up and coming, if you will, and less resourced news organizations, but very gritty, pounding the pavement and a level of street smarts that, even some of the bigger news organizations don't quite have. It's an opportunity to really kind of give a larger stage and platform and some level of training and expertise to those younger journalists. Partnership we did with City Bureau. We did a big thing with Linda Lutton, and I co-edited this project. Kate Cahan was the lead editor on it. But we're looking at mortgage lending in Chicago, and how Black and Latino neighborhoods were, as you might imagine, getting the short end of the stick and have been for decades. But the partnership with City Bureau allowed us to give a young journalist there an opportunity to really get his hands dirty. He told a first-person account of growing up in the Gilwood neighborhood and seeing the data that we had surfaced around the disparities in lending there. He told a very powerful story about his own up and coming, his family's issues with mortgage lending and how it was affecting the neighborhood. And so that collaboration gave a platform and a space to a young journalist that he might not have had, and ended up being a part of an award-winning project. And that's something that he can put on every resume that he puts on going forward. So collaboration has given us, I think, a lot more. And I think the landscape is still forming and changing. I can't say too much, but we're talking now with another news organization about working together on a big project. And we're starting out talking about audience engagement. And that's a developing part of the work that we do now as journalists. And it's becoming a more mainstream part of it. So, instead of, hey, how do we connect with people to push our stuff out, to get people connected with the journalism that we've done, we're incorporating the audience in the actual journalism and really talking, the plan is to talk through with them, what should we be covering? How should we look at this issue? How can we make it different than what's been done before? But then also using that as a reporting opportunity to talk with them about how this issue is affecting them now. Yeah. What can this work that we're doing impact the ways in which they're viewing this thing and living in their daily lives? So it's become, for a variety of different reasons, something that we're much more accustomed to, much more comfortable with. You don't really see the level of competitiveness that I think we might have seen if we were trying some of the collaboration we're doing now. We were trying that, 15, 20 years ago. So I think the landscape is promising, and we're still learning and developing. And I think it's been a really good time.
And you noted the need to get audience engagement for a long time. I would say, I think, until maybe 7 or 8 years ago, the talk of collaboration was always really to help ease the newsroom's burden, but it wasn't always focused on the communities. It was focused on, well, we need to share stories because we need more stuff. Now it seems like, and so do you think you've seen, has there been a shift in terms of how collaboratives are helping all of the communities that media in Chicago cover? Has it helped get information in front of people in ways that it could not have prior to the collaboration starting?
I would say yes. I mean, especially as you see folks like ProPublica working with Injustice Watch, and you see the Chicago Reporter working with Chicago Public Media. You see some of the like I say, the City Bureau who work with us and working with other partners. It gives an opportunity for small organizations that are focused on
pequeñas se enfoquen en las comunidades que sí le están.
And so you've got people who have an understanding of what life in those communities is like, the need for real responsible journalism, and they are partnering with institutions that can give a much larger platform and stage, that can bring resources, can bring levels of expertise with regard to the nuts and bolts of reporting on complex issues, which I think is great. The other thing that I think we've seen also is that you've seen not only has the landscape, the ecosystem diversified from the standpoint of the kinds of issues and communities that are being covered, but also you've got different types of skills that are there. You've got groups like Muckrock and DataMate who have kind of brought a whole new kind of platform and technical expertise, particularly with regard to data analysis and with regard to manipulating and working with digital platforms. And so there are things that you may have some shops that may have a specialty or a special unit that can do that kind of stuff. But given our state of thin resources, you don't have as many of those places as you had in the past. But some of these specialized shops now can come in and give that level of heft, and that can create a whole new way of in terms of the depth that you can get into on some issues. So I think you're seeing a number of those things, and that is all providing greater service because we're digging deeper. And like I said, we're giving a much more nuanced kind of coverage to communities and to particular issues than we ever have. So.
Great. So all this kind of set the tone for, tell us that the last kind of setting the tone for the last 20 years of collaboration in Chicago. Sam's going to talk some about Solving for Chicago, which is the most recent of those, which is what, 2 years old now?
Yeah.
2 years old. So, Resolve Philly was a lot of us who were looking at collaboratives. We were a part of that. So we were part of that when I was running Billy Penn, and it was a fabulous collaborative to be a part of. So that really set the tone for a lot of future collaborations. I know we talked about that a lot when we were setting this up, but just talk about what Solving for Chicago is, kind of talk a little bit about how it came together and some of the challenges. And
yeah, I mean, I think Alden did a really good job of setting the stage here. Like, everybody in Chicago is pretty much bought in on collaboration now. But that also means they all come with a lot of expectations and a lot of baggage too. So when you want to do something really big, they kind of know what they want, which was great. But the idea of doing something really big offered some new opportunities and some new challenges. I mean, it's at its base probably like a collective power thing. We're much more fractured. The audience is much more fractured. If you want to do something that leverages all the power of media that comes from having a big audience, you have to be together to do that. And boy, did COVID ever show us that too. I mean, just the amount of information needs that suddenly came up, and we didn't know where these people were, right? Like, suddenly essential workers had a ton of information needs about, how do I travel around the city? Can I get on the bus? Can I drive the bus? And we didn't know, like, great, but like, where are they? What news outlets do they subscribe to? How do we find them? How do we reach them? How do we give them this basic information? And then it transferred into all the questions around vaccines too. We had a huge number of issues that were suddenly really well equipped for us to handle, but we didn't know where they were. And that was part of the work of Solving for Chicago early on, was reaching out and figuring out where they were. When we decided we wanted to tackle essential workers, like, great, now there's this new group of people, but where are they? Right. Who reaches them? I mean, we can sort of guess that, we had the Defender as part of our group, and we sort of suspect that that's older, Black news readers, but what are their concerns versus the Southside Weekly, which is younger Black and Hispanic readers, and what are their concerns? And it was really us coming together to start to understand both what the needs were out there, and we needed to all be together to be able to reach all of them and understand what those needs were, because there was no institution. I couldn't go to the Essential Workers Institute and ask anybody. So we had to figure out where they were and what the actual needs were. And we needed to all work together to actually have some meaningful engagement with them. And then once we knew, it was a lot of work just to sort of get the reporting that Alden may be super equipped to produce, but he doesn't have the audience that needs that information. I might need to get it over to the Defender. Right. So if I'm trying to meaningfully engage and inform people that have desperate needs for information, I need some structure. I need some structure like Solving for Chicago. And that's what we ended up doing. And we'll talk in a minute too about how Evan plays into this too. But that was the big challenge, was to understand first, like, what is people and what do they need? Like, they have questions about vaccines that they're looking to us for answers for. How do we provide it? And there were a lot of simple, like, spillover effects from that too, of like, our fractured nature of our industry, while the other industries that we interact with the most with start to monopolize, like, us coming together, like, you were there for it. We were able to get site audits from Google staff for our newsrooms. That was the first time that had ever happened. We couldn't have done that. We couldn't have approached Google if we were all on our own. We needed some sort of collective base to even be able to have this sort of conversations, because they've grown so huge that sometimes they don't even see us.
Yeah. So it sounds like collaboration is starting to mean a lot more than just co-reporting. And I'm curious what some of the limits of those, what are the limits of collaboration? You obviously, we collaborated on the revenue side too. Yeah. So the idea was to try to generate revenue for those participating in it, to Stephanie's point in her kind of state of collaboration. And I know there's also collaboratives now collaborating with other collaboratives, and very meta. And Evan, this feels like a good time to bring you in as well. But Sam, why don't you start about talking about why it's Solving for Chicago newsrooms would want to partner with another collaborative? And then Evan, I'm curious to hear how all this connects on your end.
Yeah, so we had a really basic problem, which was we needed to just hear from essential workers what their information needs were, right? Like, what are they looking for from us? And it was really important for us too, because a lot of the essential workers' main jobs was, with Evan's group, was distributing vaccines. And there's an enormous number of questions around vaccines and how people make that decision to take the vaccine or not, and what role we in the news play. And we didn't even understand what our role was. We needed to have that sort of understanding. And we were lucky to have another collaborative out there that was sort of on the other side of that fence, also thinking about those sort of public information questions, which was Evan's group, which a vaccine corps at the time, and now Chicagoland Vaccine Partnership.
Did I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for letting me be here as a collaborator and slight outsider. So I've worked for the last year and a half with this group in Chicago that was focused on the inevitability of inequity in COVID outcomes, especially vaccines. So beginning late 2020, a group of funders and mostly academics saw that, of course, the same way we saw disparity in death, hospitalization, consequences of COVID, that would play out in vaccines because of the way our health systems are structured. They don't work in terms of equity. They don't work in terms of reaching people that have been historically marginalized, left out, mistreated by healthcare, subject of racist public health science, et cetera, et cetera. And our organization is a nonprofit. Similar struggles with the collaborative. We have to beg for money as well. Healthcare, has its problems, but it's mostly kind of bloat and cost and making healthcare a commodity rather than a public good or a human right. Public health has a crisis in not being strong enough. It's been disinvested and broken down. And we thought there was a place for building capacity around engagement, helping people understand what's going on, and mobilizing new voices and new people to talk about vaccines, talk about health equity, build bridges, run events, reach people where they live. And so this partnership came up. And one thing I wanted to point out just from our conversations along the way and thinking about today, when the Vaccine Corps partnership was set up as an idea, it was really run by academics, public health, kind of sciencey minded people. And the idea was to build a core of trusted messengers, outreach workers who could engage in their communities, people who know them, who share experience. But it was really driven by this kind of institutional set of actors. And we knew immediately that wasn't going to work. If we were going to build a collaborative space for the benefit of people, for the benefit of community organizations, and very particularly to bring in folks who've not been involved in public health, we had to flip the power dynamic and make a space that was for community people. And Sam and I were talking just earlier. One of the proudest things for me about the collaborative we run is, kind of the big academic medical centers, other health academics kind of don't get to talk at our meetings. We keep an open format and we keep it friendly and inviting, but we've never invited them to talk. And so the highlights come from information coming from public health and others directly to inform and create an interface for someone who runs a kind of block-sized nonprofit to speak directly with the Department of Public Health, ask questions of their epidemiology, challenge what's missing, improve the way that they're communicating. But then the other part of the meeting is just to highlight innovation, successes, failures, and building a collaborative from that direction. And so in that space, I would love Sam to talk about how it's been useful. We built a collaborative based on equity concerns, based on making space for voices that have been excluded and building capacity, which meant that some of these essential workers were in our meetings. People who were new to public health might not have even seen themselves as essential workers, but then had become that. And so we had a place of kind of problem solving, very open, dialogue about racial and other inequities in our city. And then a focus on solutions that were coming from this new set of voices. Public health and healthcare has really failed, right? We've been failing in health equity forever, and the pandemic just made it a little more bright, a little more noticeable. And to push back on that, we needed new voices. And so that's the collaborative we've created, and we're still running.
Yeah, maybe I'll give an example. So how this would actually function is I would just go to Evan's meetings and just listen to what they were talking about. And we had an agreement that it was all on background. If they wanted to use it, if our newsrooms wanted to use it, they had to call the people that had spoken in those meetings and get them to tell them again. But for me and for our group, it was really helpful just to hear. I mean, these were largely essential workers giving vaccines to other essential workers and giving the vaccines to communities too. And it was really helpful for us just to hear what their priorities were on a day-to-day basis, to hear what they were asking public officials and how it lined up with what we were asking public officials. I think one of the best examples of how we adjusted coverage in our group compared to how those outside the collaborative were covering things was, I mean, do you remember, so there was targeted vaccine dispersal in a number of neighborhoods. It was called Protect Chicago Plus. And there was a story in the Tribune about all the Facebook groups that would like go out and they'd help you figure out like, oh, well, Englewood's got some slots. If you're really desperate for a vaccine, you can go down to Englewood and get one. And it was seen as sort of like a resourceful thing, and people were being like really clever about like finding vaccines when it was hard to get one. And for the practical standpoint of how public health was affected, how the communities were affected, like we came to your group and just didn't even have to ask. You guys were already talking about that and how that sort of narrative was affecting the decisions that people were making and how it was affecting then the community's health. I mean, maybe you're better to describe like how you guys were thinking about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, how are we thinking about it? We were asking community partners to give, to be involved in the work of outreach. Someone like me has serious limits. I'm a medical doctor. I'm a nice person. I can communicate reasonably well, but I'm not a very trusted entity. I represent institutions that have impossible histories. And so what we asked is for people to come with solutions and come with suggestions. And then when there were problems, to voice them out and let us kind of amplify. We did weekly meetings. We're still doing weekly meetings. Sometimes 100, 120 different people in the room. But as the city's got good plans. The Protect Chicago plan to get vaccines more equitably out to neighborhoods because they were more vulnerable is a fine plan. But it was too small. It rolled out very slowly. And unless there were community partnerships, it didn't actually work. And so we were a place where people could say it didn't work for these reasons. We're seeing people from the north suburbs who are coming in and claiming they're an Englewood resident. We're noticing, the hours don't work. Ways of scheduling don't work. If it's all online, that's no good. We need someone to help elders or people who are over on the tech divide. So very practical, sort of quick moving problem solving. And I think that I hope that was helpful to disrupting a narrative which tends to, be a little more, forces itself to be positive and kind of describe these things as phenomena, but not actually kind of see what's going on and where the gaps are.
So Sam, why don't you just do a quick, who's in the collaborative? Like what, you don't have to list all 23. This is not a test, but if you want to just give a
Esto no
sense.
es un examen, simplemente para mostrar quién estaba en la colaboración.
Yeah, it's been allocated to about twice a month with other occasional.
Apenas nos juntamos 2 veces al mes.
From WBEZ and W2TW on the large side down to, like City Bureau is now a member, BGA is a member, Chicago Reporter, Illinois Latino News, La Raza. We do about maybe a third to a quarter of our content is now in Spanish. It is a large range of newsrooms that cover a broad section of the city, but they cover, we reach, I think 12 million, but we reach 12 million by being together. Without being together, each individual newsroom has an audience not nearly that size.
Evan, there was one quick question. You come from outside journalism and we, healthcare is not viewed as being an existential crisis the way people talk about journalism. But you've decided to collaborate as well. What's the impetus to collaborate? What's the benefit to collaborate in an industry outside of ours? Give us the outside perspective.
Right. Well, I really appreciate that framing, and I kind of rambled on it before, but American healthcare is in crisis in terms of outcomes and in terms of equity, right? There is no plan in American healthcare to do equitable work. We spend twice as much as other developed countries. Our outcomes are worse. That's a crisis. Public health, like I was saying, has been diminished. There's much lack of trust. There's a lot of lack of capacity. It's a weakened institution, and maybe we'll see some change in that. But in terms of this, this moment and this problem of helping people who've been, historically mistreated, currently mistreated, who may be sicker to begin with, who are not connected to healthcare, public health, healthcare, academic institutions, other high-minded people really haven't been able to reach people. They haven't. The outcomes are really clear. So there's a crisis in terms of actually implementing to the benefit of people who are more in need to push back on these inequities. And so we knew we had a chance to bring in, new voices, new organizations, and to build a structure both with like training and learning, also with philanthropy partners to get, money out to do mobilization work for exactly what healthcare can't do, which is to reach people who don't trust us, who don't, for good reason, don't believe in, kind of what we're doing. The elemental story of, a neighborhood that says you've neglected my neighborhood for generations. Now you want me to take a shot today that was just discovered. That's a gap I can't really bridge easily, but others can, right? And others can. So our crisis is really around lack of representation of really good innovation and capacity that has not seen itself in public health. And I think now the story I'm pounding on is remember, public health and health institutions, remember what you couldn't do and remember what was accomplished by people you just met. And let's not let go of these collaborations or we'll fall back to the patterns we were in. I'll give just like very brief story. During this
historia muy breve.
there were rollouts in Englewood and in Back of the Yards. Both had the same clinical anchor, the same health system. In Englewood, they really didn't have much in terms of community touch and groups to help mobilize and spread the word. In Back of the Yards, we got lucky and found some collaborators. And the most effective was a group called Increase the Peace. I don't know if folks know, Increase the Peace is one of the tremendous violence prevention outreach organizations in the city. It's
our collaborative covered them. It's a great,
it's a world-class universe of violence prevention. They hadn't thought about public health. It took literally a day to train a little the outreach workers to talk about vaccines, to help people get vaccination. And while the Englewood cluster lagged in terms of filling slots, Increase the Peace got us to like 90% of available vaccine slots filled because they were already known, they were already trusted to a degree. The transition from talking about interpersonal violence and guns to talking about vaccines was trivial, and it moved at lightning speed. And so we need more of that stuff.
But we covered that, and that was a really successful story for us because we started to distribute it to all these other neighborhoods, and they started saying like, "Oh, we could do that here too. Like this is something we didn't even know about." I mean, pushing here for solutions journalism too, but yeah, like we didn't even know this solution was an option until it was a story that the collaborative picked up and started pushing out to other neighborhoods too.
We've got one question from virtual attendees, and the question is mostly directed towards Sam, but Alden, some of your experience probably useful. Is what would you say to someone else who wants to start something like Solving for Chicago in another city or state? Obviously, like what Alden talked about earlier is how there's deep roots of partnership in Chicago that it's not easily replicated. But what sort of tips might you give to someone who's trying to start something like this up?
I'll say the first thing I did was call Alden. And I mean, figure out what the historical context is first. Like, what have people tried? What do they like doing? What are the systems that work? I mean, this was in the audience. I called Nissa too, and like she told me about how ProPublica, people already participate in collaboratives. They get shared content from ProPublica. They have preconceptions about how they like it to be delivered, how they like to be formatted, what kind of relationship they want to have with the newsroom. Like they have expectations already about how they want to work with others. Understand what those expectations are before you start having all the other conversations. And it takes some time. That time was something that we fought to have, and it paid off. Like the relationship was stronger because we understood where people were starting from. And I think I can't go much farther beyond that for you until you know what's the local context for you first. Like, what are the existing relationships and how can you build on those relationships into something bigger?
Does anyone in the audience have any questions for the panel? Sure, go ahead, stand up, talk loud.
Well, can you talk a little bit about, like, you meet twice a month? Are you talking about everything everyone's working on? Are you being selective about these are our focus areas where we're trying to collaborate? Like, and then are you sharing all your stories, or are there just some stories that you're sharing? How does it work for you guys?
For us, we're sharing all of our stories. And
On that topic.
on that topic, right? Yeah.
So there's a specific, always a topic.
Yeah.
So it's essential workers, and now, what is it now?
Now it's called the Path Forward, which is essentially like what are the ongoing issues for essential workers and others affected by COVID now, particularly around equity issues. I mean, our meetings were a mix of things. We tried to break up the cadence so that half the time was spent on business issues. We were making sure that, like, trying to lift all boats here, like WBEZ is a much more competent newsroom on a number of things than some of our others. So making sure we're devoting some time just to making sure that, like, we're lifting all boats, whether it's like newsletter trainings, whatever it may be, just to make sure that everyone can participate. And we're working at full capacity to the best of their ability. And then other times on the editorial side, we'd be talking about stories, what people are working on, what we've just published, where we could see it going next. And sometimes we bring in guests. You know, one of the important questions for us when the vaccines were going out was that decision-making process about taking the vaccine. And we knew that news was like part of that, but we didn't know what of it. And so we brought in Evan's colleague, Max, to just come in and talk about what they understood as that decision-making process of, like, people are going to take some action based on things they read in the news, but it's not just that. News is part of that decision. We need to understand for us, like, well, okay, what is our role in that conversation? What are all the other pieces sort of at play? It was great to be able to reach out and have a doctor come in and talk about that experience and what role we play in, like, someone's bigger decisions and bigger life and information they're looking for.
Yeah, thanks. I was curious, just thinking forward, and Evan, you were talking about relying on community groups to increase trust. As you're going forward with this project and potentially looking at other projects, how are you thinking about partnering with groups on the ground, maybe even about restoring trust in the media writ large? Because that obviously is a problem. And I think having this collaborative, all of these individual outlets who have trusted audiences are great, but, like, how do you improve on that, or how do you more deeply engage with communities on some of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to work on that problem now. I mean, the problems that have come out of COVID is sort of fractured too. Like, everyone's problems are going in different directions. So, I mean, someone may have housing problems. Someone may have, like, concerns about, like, academics for their kids now because of it. Like, it's going off in a number of different directions. We're at the point now where we're going back to some of that square one engagement work, just to, like, reconnect with people and say, like, what are the top concerns? Like, what are you worried about? Where are things going? So that we know, like, do we keep working with Evan? Do we find other groups that are in similar positions? Like, do we need a tenants' rights group? Like, because housing is a big concern. Like, we need to go back and just reconnect with people. And that's what we're doing right now, in hearing from people what their big concerns are. And I mean, to be honest, we just did one round of surveys, and we're going to start doing more engagement work from there. One of the things I was surprised to hear was, like, a lot of people changed jobs, and a lot of people changed jobs, particularly essential workers, because they were looking for something safer. Mm-hmm. That was still, like, workplace safety was still a really high concern for people in a way that I really didn't realize. And I don't think our collaborative really realized that there was a lot of people taking action still, like big actions with their life, their work, about things like workplace safety. And that, like, for essential workers, a lot of them had deep concerns about how their kids were doing academically, because they had to work while their kids were home doing remote school. And that was, like, a huge concern for the parents too. So we're trying to figure out, right now, who do we connect with? How do we, like, are these people already organized or not? Like, how do we connect with them? And how does our coverage best serve them?
I'd add one thing I wanted to bring up. When Partners in Health came to manage this nation, collaborative, and flipped the power dynamic to make it focused on community groups, to make it focused on people so far not part of public health, we opened our meetings to everyone. No restrictions. You don't even need an invitation. We spread it wide. And both our main collaborative meeting, and then we also run what we call a learning community, which is for, kind of people to get updates on COVID stuff, other public health issues, cultural issues like, racism and housing and health. And I think that's been part of the magic, is making it fully open. I don't know how that might function in a news, in a journalism environment, but we didn't and couldn't have predicted who would come and who would be, kind of helpful in driving the conversation. But part of what makes it work is it's entirely well mediated, moderated, and structured, but fully open. And that's allowed things we could have never expected. And maybe there's a place for that kind of, like you talk about the trust building aspect. That's part of how we've done it. Like, you want to see what we're doing? Come and join. You're a member because you say you're a member. And that's been, I think, really, really helpful.
Just to piggyback on that, I think the conversation is happening even outside of the sense of collaboration. I think the industry itself is starting to ask, how better do we serve people? Part of it is a function of survival, right? We need eyeballs on our web pages. We need people to buy our memberships, so let's engage with people to get a sense of what it is that they're missing, what it is they want from us. And then for like a public interest newsroom, we're also, doing a self-check on, we purport ourselves to be this public-minded, public-oriented newsroom. So how really well are we serving that, regardless of what monetary benefit might come from that, but just are we really living up to our goals and our ideals? And so, we just created a new chief audience officer to kind of lead an effort for us to be much more thoughtful around how we're engaging with people, how we're understanding what they want from us, and how best we can deliver on that.
So we are out of time, but I just want to take off my moderator hat and put on my Knight Foundation hat for 1 second and say, we were one of the funders of the acquisition of the Chicago Sun-Times. And one of the things that makes this project exciting for all of us is to have someone really at the top of a media market who's not just willing to collaborate, but's been a leader in collaboration in the city for a long time. And I know a lot of us are excited to see what happens with this combined organization and what it can do to really inspire more collaboration inside Chicago. So excited about that.
Thank you.